Hello, and welcome back to the Sandbox asynchronous tutorial on generative AI. This is part 3 of a 4-part series, and in this session, we'll be covering prompt engineering and evaluating AI outputs. It is absolutely critical to understand some of the art and science behind prompt engineering if you are looking to use AI more effectively. It is equally important to develop the critical thinking skills needed to critically evaluate the AI outputs that we receive. So let's dive in. To interact with AI tools, we must give it a prompt. Now, when most of us start interacting with AI tools and prompting, we usually provide a simple sentence or a simple question. And those types of prompts have their time and place, of course. But prompt engineering and prompt crafting refers to the art and science of developing a prompt that is better suited for GPT functions. So in the first session of this 4-part series, we walked through how a GPT analyzes our prompt. So when we have that understanding, we can utilize prompt engineering skills to write a more effective prompt that produces a higher quality output. Prompt engineering and prompt crafting usually refers to prompts that are at least a couple of paragraphs long. And also, many employers are listing this as an employable skill. They want to see possible employees who can utilize AI effectively to be more productive or even more creative in the work environments. So let's take a look at prompting more specifically. Like I mentioned, prompting is how we interact with AI machines, but there are 3 core elements that make up a good prompt. A good AI prompt should have context, direction, and control. We want to provide all the information that AI needs to succeed in our interaction. We also need to provide clear directions of what to do with that information and also how to interact with us. And also, we must be trying to put some control through our prompts as well. We can actually control how AI processes our information and the output that it receives. We must strive to have these 3 core elements in a well-engineered or well-crafted prompt. And as a reminder, when we are using AI tools, we are training AI tools. So remember the fact that the prompts can be used in AI learning. So if you're not comfortable with having that information shared through a large language module training, be sure to cut it out before feeding it through a prompt. But let's look more deeply. There are many different types of prompts. There are casual or brief, which is the simple sentences or questions that we often start off with prompting, and of course those have their time and place. But there are also more conversational or refined prompts, and you may have dived into this area of prompting as well, where you've started off with a simple prompt and then you start chatting with an AI tool to really hone in on what you're looking for or the information that you're seeking. So this kind of back and forth is very common in AI tools and is a different type of prompt. But prompt engineering and prompt crafting really strives for structured or step-by-step prompts. These are prompts that are specifically laid out with all the information that AI needs to know for producing a higher quality output, and also provides a structure and step-by-step guide of how you want AI to not only understand the information you've provided, but how to find information, how to interact with that information, and how to repurpose that information in an output. A well-engineered or a well-crafted prompt does still have the context, direction, and control, but it often becomes longer as we provide more and more information and even start to provide a structure or guide for how I want AI to interact with me. So this is kind of what prompt engineering and prompt crafting looks like in its more final form. But let's look at some strategies that you can use. One of the frameworks that I really like to use for prompting is the CLEAR framework. Now, this stands for concise, logical, explicit, adaptive, and reflective. So we want to make sure that our prompts are very concise. Vague language does not work when it comes to AI prompts. We want to be concise, and we also want to provide logic. We also want to make sure that we are explicit in what we are asking, but that we also make sure that we are adaptive. One of the great things about utilizing AI is that we can have follow-ups, so we can actually continue working with AI to make sure that the output is exactly what we're looking for and we can be a little bit adaptive. And lastly, we want to be reflective. Sometimes prompt engineering can actually take a long time, and it can actually be quite a long prompt. So make sure that when you are doing some prompt engineering and prompt crafting and you really took the time to develop a well-crafted or well-engineered prompt, that maybe you save it. Maybe start creating a glossary of terms or a glossary of prompts that work for you and the type of information, the type of work that you're conducting. So there are so many other frameworks to consider. Clear is my favorite, but you might want to explore some of these other options to see which one works for you. They all kind of refer to the same concepts. We're still looking for that context, direction, and control, and we're also going to be using our frameworks to provide requests. So what I want AI to do with that information. So you'll see in a lot of these examples that they're talking about the same thing, they just use some different terminology. So maybe there's a word that connects with you more effectively when you are prompting than clear, and feel free to use that. They all kind of refer to the same thing. These are some of the basics that I like to share for AI prompting. The first is context and role play. So like I mentioned, a well-engineered prompt offers AI a lot of context. AI is a very powerful tool. It has lots of sources of information, but AI is only as good as it gets. If I provide very little information, my output will be of poor quality. But the more information that I can provide to AI to utilize in its output, the better the output will be. So talk about background information, scenario information, audience information, tone information. Really flesh out the whole scenario for AI. It will really change the quality of your output. And providing context to AI does refer to providing it with information, but we can also use context as a way to provide direction. As I mentioned, we also want to clearly direct AI of how to interact with us. And a very easy way to start manipulating AI's interaction is starting with role play. So you can actually tell AI to assume a role. So for example, I could say, acting as a medical professional, what are some symptoms of high blood pressure? Now, I've done this example many times with Copilot. If I say, what are some symptoms of high blood pressure, it usually gives me an answer, and the source is msn.com, which is not a good source of medical information. If I position my prompt by saying, acting as a medical professional, what are some symptoms of high blood pressure? I usually get a more detailed answer, and the sources are Mayo Clinic or the Canadian Heart Association. This is because when you ask AI to assume a role, you're giving AI perspective. It actually provides more context for AI. It understands the voice that it should be speaking into in this interaction. So when you give AI a role that has some authority, it tries to have more attention to detail and find better sources of information. So role play is an essential part of crafting a better prompt. And in the same vein of trying to provide more direction for AI, we can also offer it a couple more things. For example, we could say, think deeply before responding. This is a little simple trick that you can throw into your prompts because AI tools are designed to be fast. They often will give you their first thought. But if I give AI permission to take its time and think deeply before responding, it usually provides a better output. Again, AI is designed to be fast, so its default is first thought, and it won't deviate from its defaults unless given permission to do so. So if you say, think deeply before responding, you're giving it permission to take its time and source out the material better, and maybe produce a better output as well. So think deeply before responding. Additionally, you can say, ask me any follow-up questions that you need answered to provide a better output. Again, as a default, AI will not ask you any questions if it doesn't fully comprehend your prompt. If it doesn't fully comprehend your prompt, it will make an assumption and then run with it. But if you give AI permission to ask you questions, it will start to say, oh, can you elaborate on what you mean here? Or can you provide more information on this concept? And by giving AI permission to ask us questions, we can provide more context so that when it actually produces an output for us, it is of higher quality. Lastly, another tip that I have for providing that direction that we want to see in a well-engineered or well-crafted prompt is you can even tell it what type of sources to focus in on. If you've ever done a Google search, you know that you have access to about 2 million pieces of information online, which is probably overwhelming for you. It's also overwhelming for AI. So sometimes as a student, it's hard to tell what source is quality and which isn't. Same with AI. So when it's processing its information, it almost gives equal value to blogs versus government websites. But we can manipulate that by providing more direction in our prompts. We can start off by saying, focus on scholarly articles, or focus on government websites, or focus in on vetted information. All of this is providing direction for how AI to interact with us. So when we take the time to write out all the context for all the information it needs, plus providing context on how I want it to interact with me, so providing those directions, we are already starting from a great place to get a much better output. But this is only part one of a part two kind of simple structure that you can use in prompting. We have all of our information laid out and all of the directions for how it's supposed to interact with me. But then the second part of this prompt can be instructions. So after I laid out all the information that it needs to succeed, plus how I want it to interact with me, I can now put a space and then start my second part of a prompt structure, which will be focused in on instructions. So now I'm using the term instruction here, but you might hear the term request or action or task. All of these are referring to the same thing. And it's referring to the fact that after I provided all this information, now I am making a request for AI. So I can lay out all the information it needs, how it's interacting with me, and then I can say, acting as a college professor, develop a practice quiz that I can use as a college student to prepare for my final exam. This is my instruction, this is my request, this is my task, this is something that I am asking AI to perform for me using the information that I've provided. Now, if you remember back to session 1, this is the token that the GPT is looking for. So by writing a prompt that first outlines all the information it needs, plus all the directions, and then providing a space, and then making our request or our instruction, our task, AI will look at that prompt and understand, okay, here's all the information I need, and then there's the token. So AI will look for that token, that request. So make sure that it is concise and that it is easily identifiable. So really make sure that it stands out a little bit. And then after we make our request, we want to provide more information on that request. So I made that request and now I can start saying, make the quiz 10 questions long, period. Make the quiz multiple choice, period. Make each question have 4 possible answers, period. What I am doing here is writing simple and clear, quick sentences that describe the task or request that I have made for AI to conduct. So essentially what I'm doing here is here's the token and here's a logical explanation of the instructional set that I want you to perform to actually achieve that request. So what I'm doing here is making the token very clear and then elaborating on that token, and I am building in a logical explanation of how I envision the output. This is extremely important for AI processing. By writing out all the context, the direction, and by providing that request and then subsequent explanatory sentences for that request, I am achieving context, direction, and control. Because through the request and the simple sentences that follow, I am controlling the output. I am describing what I'm looking for. It is a critical part of writing a better prompt. And those explanatory quick sentences are known as outcome indicators. Again, if you remember from the part 1 of this session when I talked about GPT functions, I mentioned predefined stopping criteria. Now, in prompting, predefined stopping criteria is outcome indicators. So in order to write a well-engineered or well-crafted prompt, we not only need that context, direction, and control and all that information in the request, but we also need to be explicit about when we want AI to stop. Again, if you remember back to session 1, I said it will repeat its steps many, many times until it reaches a maximum token limit or predefined stopping criteria. So in those explanatory quick sentences that I just talked about, if I provide clear outcome indicators, so clear understanding for when AI can stop, I am setting up AI for success from beginning to end. So for example, there's a big difference of saying, write me a paragraph and write me a paragraph of 500 words. That 500 words is an actionable item that AI can identify as an outcome indicator. So when it can stop its AI processing. So in the example I just shared, a quiz, make the quiz 10 questions long. So 10 questions. Make the quiz multiple choice. Make each question have 4 possible answers. So what I'm doing is being super explicit about when AI can stop its processing, because I've laid out a clear understanding and vision of the request that I made. So once I've made that request, there are some extra elements that I can incorporate into my prompt to make it more effective. One of the most helpful things that we can do is provide examples. Tools like ChatGPT and Copilot can actually access external links, so use that to your advantage. Maybe there's something that you wanted to present to it as a reference, or an example that you wanted to build upon or emulate. Utilize that to your to your advantage when you are providing all the context it needs. Provide examples, something for it to reference. So there's a lot of great opportunities to utilize this. I know a lot of students who find a good research article and then submit the link to Copilot and say, help me find related research. Now that can be effective use of AI to help you conduct research, but just as a reminder, AI can only access content that's freely available online, so you might actually only be seeing a snippet of the information available when you're conducting research. So it can be a helpful starting point to do research, but definitely not the final product. And there's definitely a lot more aspects of research that should be conducted than just asking AI, but it can definitely be a very helpful way of conducting research. There's some more content on this slide that you can access in the description below, but some final tips here: use plain English whenever possible, provide as much background information, and if you do not have a specific role to reference, you can always say act as an expert. That's a helpful way to make sure that it's being more attention to detail when it's producing an output for you. But something that's really important is to divide a complex concept into smaller prompts. So as I've been saying throughout this asynchronous tutorial, we want to bring AI as a tool into the process where appropriate, where it can help us. We don't want to use AI to automate the whole process and we're just sitting on the sidelines. We still want to be in control, but we want to be utilizing AI to help us through the process. And this is really important not only from an academic integrity point of view, but also from an output quality point of view. If I ask AI to do everything, I usually get nothing. So if I bring it in more segmented, I can actually usually get a better output that I can use as the part of the process of creating or researching. For example, if I was to ask AI to tell me everything I need to know about podcasting, I usually get a simple paragraph with not much helpful specific information. But if I think about what needs to get done for me to record the next best podcast, the first step might be brainstorming ideas. So I can go to AI and ask it to help brainstorm ideas for a podcast series. And I can even ask, are there existing podcasts that cover this content? Because, we don't want to maybe be competing with a different podcast. And then once I've settled on an idea, I can then start maybe coming up with some ideas for an episode. And I can go to AI and say, help me develop a script for a 20-minute long podcast episode that discusses the impacts of climate change. Help me write it in a way that facilitates conversation using open-ended questions and general talking points. And then I can use AI as maybe a writing tool for when I'm creating that script for a podcast. And then later in the process, after I've recorded the audio and I'm editing it in Logic Pro, for example, I could go back to AI and say, I have the audio, I'm editing it in Logic Pro. What are some of the basic standards that I need to meet in order for having my podcast hosted on Spotify and Apple Podcasts? So thinking about AI as a tool, as a part of the process, rather than automating the whole process, is an important way of framing AI for academic integrity, for professional environments, and also for a quality point of view. So try to break it up, and think about it in a segmented approach where we can get more specific, because then we get better quality results. So some of the basic rules here: make it specific, give it all the context it needs, guide the response, and always review and revise by fact checking. So make sure you do that. Now that we've learned a little bit more about prompting and how to use AI more effectively, let's switch focus and talk about evaluating generative AI outputs. This is a critical aspect of critical thinking when it comes to utilizing AI. Every time we use AI, we must be using our critical thinking skills to evaluate the information we see. So let's get into some specifics here. Something that I've highlighted in the first session of this tutorial is the fact that AI tools can fall behind. There's definitely a currency issue that comes up with AI tools, specifically the tools that rely solely on large language module training. Tools like ChatGPT and Copilot have two sources of information, their training and the internet. So those tools can typically stay up to date a little bit more than other tools. But tools that only rely on large language module training can fall behind quite quickly. They can fall behind 2, sometimes 3 years. And this is because large language module training takes time. So it's really important to evaluate the information we see with a critical lens on the currency of the information that we're seeing. On screen, you are seeing an example of a prompt that I fed to an AI tool on December 2023, and it said, as of my last knowledge update in September 2021. So in this scenario, it was over two and a bit years old information that I was seeing. And I was specifically asking about government information. So government information from 2 and a bit years ago might be pretty outdated at this point, specifically because between December 2023 and September 2021 and December 2023, there was a federal election, so things can definitely change. We live in a very fast-paced information era, so a 2 or sometimes 3 years delay on information can be quite significant. So make sure you're evaluating the information from this specific lens first and foremost. But there's also some ways to really structure our way of processing information. One of the ways is to think about it as the SIFT method. So the first step of a SIFT method is to stop and think, stop and evaluate what we're looking at. This might feel super basic, but there's a lot of examples of people seeing content online, and before they even stop to consider, is this something that is actually correct, they just take it at face value and run with it. So make sure you stop and think, hey, is this true, or is this something that needs further investigation? So make sure you take the time to stop and think about what you're seeing. There's an example of a viral video that went crazy on the internet talking about purple apples from Saskatchewan, and there's no such thing as purple apples from Saskatchewan. So you want to stop and evaluate the information we're looking at before taking it at face value. Now that we've stopped to evaluate the information that we see, let's move to step number 2, which is investigate the source. This is a very important part of critically evaluating any information we see online, whether it's AI, social media, or Google searching as well. We have to investigate the source and see where the information is coming from. This is specifically true with AI tools because they're the AI hallucination issues that come up. We must investigate the source to see if it has any authority to be speaking on this, and whether or not it has been manipulated by AI in a way that misleads the original purpose of the source. So always investigate the source of information. If in your investigation you determine that the source of information does not have authority to be speaking on this topic, we should move to step number 3, which is find better coverage. Now, AI can only access free content, so it doesn't always have the best sources. So sometimes it's a better route to focus in on some library resources, for example, because there's lots of scholarly peer-reviewed articles, books, and videos that are vetted by librarians and meet a professional standards. So sometimes it's better to find better resources than the ones that AI is presenting to us, specifically if during our investigation we determine that the source that AI pulled from doesn't really have authority to be speaking on this topic. There's a big difference between pulling information from someone's personal blog and a government source of information. So we must be having that critical lens on where the sources are and whether or not they have authority to be speaking on this subject. Lastly, it's very important to always trace to the source and get the full picture. We live in an information social media era where things are taken out of context all the time for soundbite and clickbait, and we must investigate it to the source so that we can get the full picture of the original content and the original author's point of view. There's so many examples of things being misled on purpose, so make sure you always trace to the source and make your decision based on the source material. Now, the SIFT method is just one. We've been teaching as librarians the CRAP method for many years to evaluate information. So always ask yourselves these 5 questions when you're evaluating information. We already talked about this. We started the whole section with this, but is it current? Is the information current? A really big, important question to ask yourself when you're looking at AI information. Next, is this information relevant? Is it relevant to my research query? Is it relevant to what I'm looking at? Next, does it have authority to be speaking on this topic? I already talked a little bit about this. We have to really focus in on, does it have authority? And also, is it accurate? This can be sometimes difficult to determine, but it's sometimes really important to cross-reference sources to make sure that one claim is substantiated by others, or at least it's backed up by a scientific method, and there's some research and methodology behind it. So make sure you focus in on authority and accuracy. And lastly, purpose. What was the purpose behind this publication? This can sometimes be really difficult to figure out, but there's a lot of examples of experts that are being paid to write an article or write a piece that suggests a certain narrative over the other for nefarious purposes. So we want to make sure that the research that we are considering for our research processes has a purpose that is not misleading or misrepresented. So make sure you ask yourselves these 5 questions when you're evaluating information you see online. Some other things to look for when we are evaluating AI text is that AI text can be quite redundant sometimes, can really kind of get repetitive, and it can be very devoid of specifics. Sometimes when we think an AI output looks good, when we start to actually look at it with a closer lens, we start to realize it's not actually saying much. It's all fluff, and it's kind of repeating itself in different ways. So a lot of sometimes our outputs are not actually high quality because it's redundant and devoid of really anything concrete or anything specific. AI also loves to use cliches and extra flowery language, so this is something to watch out for. Sometimes it writes in a way that sounds like okay, but if you read it out loud, it starts to be like, oh, this is an overly complicated sentence that really isn't saying much. Again, this is AI being extra flowery, kind of redundant, because it's lacking some information. So it just starts to fill in the information voids with extra words that sometimes overcomplicate a sentence. And they also sometimes use weird word choice. Sometimes a actual definition of a word is very different from the way that we use it in the vernacular. So sometimes the word choice feels a little bit off or strange or a little bit off from the tone perspective as well. So another thing to look out for. Also, when an AI produces an output, they often use a lot of emojis, so that's something to look out for if you're ever on social media or LinkedIn and you see a post and there's like a questionable amount of emojis. It might have been AI generated, which is not a bad thing. It's just something to look for. So just evaluate the AI from a source information perspective, but also a quality perspective when it comes to evaluating AI text. Thank you for attending part 3 of this asynchronous tutorial on generative AI. As always, I'm presenting to you some helpful resources that you might want to consider exploring on your own time. On the screen here, there are 6 prompting resources that I recommend. The top 3 are courses that you can take for free, and some of them even give you a prompt engineering badge that you can post on your LinkedIn if that's something you're looking for. And the bottom 3 here are websites all about prompting that you can use to deepen your prompt engineering skills. And lastly, I have 5 resources here that really help focus in on our critical thinking skills as we evaluate the outputs that we see from generative AI. So I highly recommend that you explore some of these concepts, ideas, and resources to better your prompt engineering skills and to really hone in on those critical thinking skills that are absolutely necessary for evaluating generative AI outputs. Thank you.